Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. We're starting the 4th chapter today. And sometimes you hit a place in the Gita that doesn't per se need an introduction. Things are discreet enough that you can just deal with the text cold without any context, and it still makes sense. Usually, I always like to give some kind of a somewhat lengthy introduction, just to warm people up to the scene and some of the specifics of it, and also the teachings which have preceded whatever we'll be dealing with that day. But here, you don't really need that. This 4th chapter, from the beginning, it starts off, and it's almost like an entirely new subject, and that subject does not depend on what came previously. Later on today, I'll mention what came previously, but I think you'll see that it's not relevant. Krishna starts off the chapter, and he says, I instructed this imperishable science of yoga to the sun god, Vivishvan. And Vivishvan instructed it to Manu, who the father of mankind. And Manu, in turn, instructed it to Ikshvaku. So, these verses a lot of times are somewhat difficult to penetrate because they use a bunch of names that most people aren't familiar with. Here we have Vivishvan and Manu and Ikshvaku. And so we could spend a considerable amount of time introducing those 3 people. I don't think it's important. I think that you can read the verse like this. Imam avyaya yogam proktam aham. I spoke of this eternal yoga, this eternal science of yoga, this eternal knowledge of yoga. And you could just say a long time ago would be really the only purport you needed to state. At the beginning of the universe, millions of years ago, at the dawn of creation, billions of years ago, at the dawn of creation. I spoke this at the dawn of creation. That's enough of a read, of a purport, for us to be able to move forward with this verse. I spoke this eternal science of yoga at the dawn of creation. Now, if I said to you, I spoke this science of yoga at the dawn. If I said to you, like if we're sitting at a bus stop, and I say to you, this eternal wisdom at the dawn of creation, you and I are sitting at a bus stop together, and I tell you that, what would you think about that? Yeah?
You are very old and possibly God.
It's not what I would think. You're not actually thinking about the question properly. I gave you the context of how I wanted you to think about it. What would you think?
That the word eternal.
Hare Krishna Prabhuji. Can I answer, Prabhu? This is Dinesh Das.
Of course you can, Nijadamji. We're happy to have you, but 3 other people have raised their hands, and somebody already wrote in. If you want to cut the queue, it's okay.
No, sorry, I could not see the queue, Prabhu.
Okay.
Sorry.
It's okay. I got you. Madhuri, what would you think?
I would think you were crazy.
Yeah. If you were to think I might be God, you're crazy. I gave you the context. We're sitting at a bus stop having a conversation, and I tell you, hey, I instructed somebody in this knowledge at the dawn of creation. There's something wrong with you if you would think that that was an okay statement to make. If you think I'm God, there's something really wrong with you. So that means you're kind of a new age weirdo, but you're legitimately should be put in a nut house. Anybody who doesn't have Madhuri's answer, there's something wrong with you. You're sitting at a bus stop with somebody, and they say to you, I'm going to share some wisdom with you that I spoke at the dawn of creation. You follow? What do you mean you spoke at the dawn of creation? Who do you think you are? The next thing I know, I'm Jesus. You know what I mean? That's what you would expect. That's how the conversation would go. Now, there is a context in which people say this kind of mumbo jumbo. They say this kind of mumbo jumbo, like if they're a medium. I watched somebody on Oprah. I don't know I saw it recently actually, and Oprah said how old are you, or where are you from, or this or that. And the woman said, who Oprah was talking to, she said, I have come many times and been known by many names, and she gave some kind of standard cryptic medium style, seance style answer, and everybody was like, ooh. I thought that just sounds profoundly foolish. You follow? You see how you didn't follow the question properly? You see how you got a little too new agey on me? I mean, do you believe that the people are just like mediums or like there's avatars floating around all over the place? You're going to meet them at a bus stop?
No,
Yeah, you weren't listening carefully. All right. So anybody who has an answer other than Madhuri's answer, I think, got it wrong. You would think the person's crazy, and you would legitimately think the person's crazy. Nijadamji, you wanted to say something, so please speak your piece now.
Yes, Prabhuji, I was also thinking is that, in a bus stop, if somebody comes and says that, at the dawn I said this message, I would first be actually very perplexed as to who this person is.
You'd be perplexed. I wouldn't be perplexed. I would understand very clearly that you were mentally deranged. I would then quickly assess whether you were a danger to yourself or others. If you were not, I would leave that place because I don't like hanging out with crazy people. And if I thought you were a danger to yourself or others, I would call the authorities and then leave the place. Maybe wait until they got there so you didn't hurt yourself or anybody else, and then I'd leave that place. I wouldn't be perplexed. I'd be absolutely clear. You are crazy, you're a nut, and I'm not taking you seriously. If somebody doesn't have that answer, I start to worry about you. What do you think, Kat?
I agree.
What do you think, Lola?
I agree completely.
Tanya?
I agree.
As a medical doctor, right? That would be your medical opinion, right?
I think maybe the person's high on drugs.
Maybe on drugs, which means chemically crazy.
Yeah, 100%. Probably both. Honestly.
Sure, crazy, high on drugs. It's certainly delusions of grandeur, and it's almost like a psychotic episode. They've lost so much touch with reality. Okay, good. We're all on the same page. That's what I'm thinking. Of course, that does lead to a pretty natural question. Why do we not reject Krishna at this point? In what context is that an okay statement to make? Okay, it was a long time ago. All right, so you're at a camel stop. You follow? That doesn't improve the situation, right? Okay. You're at a camel stop thousands of years ago. That doesn't improve the situation, does it? So why is it that Krishna makes a ridiculous statement like this? Oh, here's Arjuna's response. Krishna continues. This supreme science was thus received through the chain of disciplic succession, and the saintly kings understood it in that way. But in due course of time, the succession was broken, and therefore the science as it is appears to be lost. This answers a why Krishna's saying it a second time, because it got, through entropy, it got degraded over time, and therefore he has to speak it again. But does it deal with our problem of Krishna being a nut job? It doesn't. He's at least a semi-logical nut job, but a lot of times you get a real crazy person, they have an elaborate alternative world they live in. And when you start to question them, they come up with explanation after explanation after explanation to justify the situation that they find themselves in, which seems untenable. There's something called QAnon. QAnon is a far right-wing conspiracy theory that essentially holds that Trump is Sir Lancelot. He's like some kind of savior figure. And Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama and some other people are part of some sort of child sex ring. And they're devil worshippers and, such. And that Trump is the savior who's going to bring in a golden age. And he partnered up with Mueller to create an environment where the truth could come out and these people could be shown to be demoniac, Rothschild-like Illuminati-style figures that are running the world. QAnon, from a guy who posted on 4chan, which is an anonymous message site. And then, and people are into it. And Trump, one time in a speech, mentioned the eye of the storm, and they're like, ooh, that's a special statement. That indicates the storm is coming, and the storm is this cataclysmic event which will set the world right. And so it's somewhat popular. I think maybe 5% of the country is into it, something like that, which is a huge number of people. But you see sometimes military people with QAnon patches on, and then Q is a Q level of clearance that's there in the nuclear Department of Nuclear Energy. They have a Q clearance, which is their highest level of clearance. So apparently this person has a Q clearance, which is this cryptic high level clearance of the government. he's got no evidence for any of his claims. But he says them, and it's almost like he's speaking in a very, very old language. What I mean is that there's a phenomenon in the world called millenarianism, which is a little different than millennialism. Millenarianism is this idea that there's an apocalypse coming, and that the world's going to hell, and that and it's like you're specially chosen, and something amazing is about to happen, and usually there's a deluge, a flood, or there's a fire, and people are going to die. Sometimes people commit ritual suicide. But these millenarian cults have existed since well before the time of Christ. And they pop up historically in all major religions. And the people have a wanton disregard for their life and safety and the expectation that the end is near. Actually, the Jehovah's Witnesses thought the world was going to end in 1975 or 76. And their church saw a massive reduction when it didn't happen. And so these millenarian cults, sometimes they do like the Heaven's Gate cult in San Diego. A bunch of people commit suicide. Or Jim Jones, they got into it in Guyana. It's not exactly clear whether they're a full millenarian cult or not. He gave people a bunch of Flavor Aid, which is where the phrase "you drank the Kool-Aid" comes from. 200 plus people died there when they were discovered. These cults have been around for a long time. There's groups of people in Cambodia and Thailand, Buddhists, who drink mercury and commit ritual suicide, have been for centuries. And so there's these different groups, and they become really fanatic, and they can't wait to get back to paradise, and they get a little jihadist or a little suicidal, or both, in order to foment the coming age, usually a golden age, coming out of an iron age. QAnon. And so then when he makes claims, all his claims are super cryptic, so they're like, people can just interpret them as much as they want to. But then he makes claims sometimes that don't come true. And then he'll usually say, oh yeah, I had to do that to give some misinformation to like throw the powers that be off my track. But what you end up with is an unfalsifiable theory, a theory which can never be disproven, because you don't mind keeping it alive with 1,000 cuts. They usually say death by 1,000 cuts. If you qualifying your theory, eventually Occam's razor does you in, and it's like you die the death of 1,000 cuts because it just becomes so untenable. Like, hey, what's the temperature? It's 1,000 degrees out right now. Well, I have a thermometer here that says it's not. That thermometer is not correct. What it says here was, checked by the underwriter laboratories. Yes, those people are in on the conspiracy. Well, how come we're not burning it up? How come we're not burning up? Actually, human beings can survive temperatures of over 1,000 degrees. Or you're wearing a protective suit. How come I don't see the suit? Because you've been hypnotized. You follow, you just keep going. And provided all you have to do is come up with a really clever theory, you can go on forever because you don't have to give any evidence. Richard Dawkins is a fairly well-known atheist. He's one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, the new atheists, along with Daniel Dennett and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris. The four horsemen of the apocalypse. They're like the new atheist movement, kind of semi-sophisticated thinkers that propound atheist dogma, and they're very evangelical about it. Anyway, sometimes I watch theists debate with these atheists, and you get two expert witnesses up together, they bounce off each other a bit, and sometimes you hear a new argument or something like that, but it's fairly formulaic how the debates go. One of the things I hate when people do with Richard Dawkins is they'll try to make this irreducible complexity argument, which is a fairly difficult argument to make. The irreducible complexity argument is that the universe is by its very nature irreducibly complex, and therefore it had to be created by somebody. It couldn't have arisen by random chance. And the amount of time we've had in the universe, the amount of chemical interactions that could have gone on, life would not have arisen by chance, because the strings of proteins which are required to produce, reproducible DNA are just too complicated. And if you split the universe down into tiny, atom-sized laboratories, and you had chemical interactions randomly going off from the creation of the universe, whatever it was, 15 billion years ago, whatever it is, not enough time would have passed in order for that to have risen by random chance. You actually get mathematical about it. That's the argument for irreducible complexity. A simpler version of it might be that the human eye could not have arisen by chance, because the human eye all the parts that are required for it to work could not have evolved from one another sequentially, because if random genetic mutation was the cause of everything, then every stage of a random genetic mutation, it would have to be beneficial to the organism. Otherwise, it would get bled out. So it'd have to be beneficial at every stage. But then something like the eye is irreducibly complex. It only works when all the parts are there. So you'd have to evolve it in such a way where at every stage it was beneficial and it got to its present form. But its present form doesn't show that it evolved like that. It shows that it needs all the parts working together. So like a car wouldn't have evolved, because it has complicated parts that have to work. Sometimes I'll give an example, like, imagine building a car from scratch by, whereas like it has to be running and driving the entire time. And so it's like, that's the demands of natural selection. It has to be beneficial to the organism. So then you'll get like a smart person and you'll say, show me a model by which the human eye or a mousetrap could have evolved by chance. Even something as simple as a mousetrap, sometimes they challenge. But the thing is, you get a good evolutionary biologist, which is actually Richard Dawkins' specialty. He's an evolutionary biologist. I think he's at Cambridge. And so that's his specialty. So you ask an evolutionary biologist to come up with theoretical models by which complicated systems could have evolved through random genetic mutation and natural selection. That's what they do all day. They come up with really, really good theories and models for how that could have happened, computer-generated models for how that could have happened. And so you can get a blind watchmaker. You can get an eye evolving from a light-sensitive spot that helps an organism survive. You get a mousetrap where at every step the mousetrap is beneficial, but new parts are introduced. But that doesn't mean any evidence has been given that that's actually what happened. Do you follow? If I say this couldn't possibly have happened, then to win the debate, all you have to do is show how it possibly could have happened. You're not required to give any evidence that that's actually what happened. You're not required to find anything in the fossil record that that's actually what happened. Similarly, QAnon, millenarian cults, and crazy people who are intelligent. They'll come up with a fantastic story that has no evidence for it. But then if you try to question them, that it's illogical what they're saying, or it's impossible what they're saying, they'll just get creative and pull a Richard Dawkins on you and come up with a more and more sophisticated theory, because they're no longer bound to have it be probabilistic. They're no longer bound to have it be like have any evidence to support it, and they can start to explain why they're Jesus and how they're Jesus and what that means and the significance of it all. The Branch Davidians were another millenarian cult in Waco, Texas. They had their guy, David Koresh, who was, your like average run-of-the-mill sex cult leader. But, they were stockpiling guns like there was no tomorrow. And then, anyway, it's a whole story. They just did a movie about it. I grew up. I was a new Hare Krishna devotee when Waco hit in '93. So I watched it on the news when it actually went down. And Ruby Ridge before that. I saw it on the news. It was a live event. It wasn't like a movie was made 30 years later. I saw it in real life. But anyway, the ATF came down on them. All their guys broke out their guns. They had whatever, couple months standoff, which wound up with the whole place burning down and tons of kids and adults dying and a horrible fire. That's another millenarian cult. But if you listen to David Koresh talk, he was knew his Bible, and provided he didn't give you any real evidence, he spun a good yarn. And so the QAnon guy, we're like, well, that didn't come true. He's like, yes, but I did that on purpose. You follow? So provided you never require the evidence, and you can do that kind of show game, then a good talker can win. When people show themselves to be liars, you know what you do? You watch what they do. You don't listen to what they say. Everybody encounters liars in their life. When you meet a liar, stop listening to their words and start watching their actions. Look for evidence. It's an important skill in critical thinking. So, although this verse gives us a why, it still doesn't make it any more reasonable. At the dawn, I'm sitting with you at a bus stop or a camel stop a long time ago, and I say to you, I taught this ancient science at the dawn of creation. And I taught it, I'm teaching it again to you now because it's been lost through entropy. Doesn't make it any less crazy. It just means I'm a clever psycho. You follow? And there's lots of clever psychos. And there's lots of fairly interesting, for instance, I used to have toy stores. And at my toy stores, they would have new toys that we introduced. And sometimes new toys would be introduced, and they would be okay, there's an angel, and her name is Jezebel. Forgive me, it's not really a name for an angel, but whatever. There's an angel, and her name was Jezebel, and she has blue wings, and she changes her wings depending on her mood. Actually, no, her wings change color depending on her mood. And she has her friends. And here are her friends, and they're the nine levels of angels, from cherubs up to seraphim up to archangels. And they live in a world called Asgard, which is a name for the Norse heaven. They live in a world called Asgard. It's at the end of a rainbow. And you just start telling people, this is the world. And you sell them the rainbow and the attachment, wings, and the different other animals or the different other angels, and it's a whole little set. And you talk to a kid and you just tell them this is the world, and they just transport themselves into that world. Sans evidence. It's relatively easy to construct an alternative world. It's a good science fiction writer can do that. L. Ron Hubbard did that, and he made a religion out of it. You follow? So although Krishna's given us a little bit of a why, I don't think he's overcome the hurdle of, come on, man. Really? You were a guru and now all of a sudden you're God? This very ancient science of the relationship with the Supreme is today told by me to you because you're my devotee as well as my friend, and you can therefore understand the transcendental mystery of this science. All right, so now you're special, and you're the chosen one, which is that's usually a thing, right? Something special about you because you're part of my cult. You recognize me, and therefore that makes you special. That's kind of a standard feature of any of these funky millenarian style religions, cults. So you're the chosen one. All right. It also makes sense that if God did exist, and God is by his very nature beyond us, we're small and God is huge. God's the creator and we're the created. God, by his very definition, is omnipotent, omnipresent, omniscient, omnibenevolent being. Therefore, God would categorically be beyond our ability to comprehend with our limited faculties of reason, And so the only way to really understand God would be through a tradition of grace. Although it works as a philosophical point, it doesn't really rescue Krishna from the question of like, what do you mean? You follow? Come on. You were here at the dawn of creation teaching this science? What do you really mean? Like, what are you saying? And so Arjuna, even thousands of years ago, at the camel stop, says, the sun god Vivishvan is senior by birth to you. How am I to understand it? In the beginning, you instructed this science to him. So Arjuna's saying, hey, wait a second. You're like in your 30s. Like, what do you mean you are here at the dawn of creation? I'm looking at you. You couldn't be over. Your driver's license says 32. What are you saying? You follow? You got it? Krishna responds back, many, many births have both you and I passed. I can remember all of them, but you cannot. All right, so now Krishna's like some kind of cosmic Silver Surfer-esque, semi-omniscient, although that's an oxymoron, super intelligent being. There's no evidence of that. Just says it. So how do we deal with this? How do we deal with this claim that's made sans evidence? How do we differentiate between Krishna and the homeless dude you met last week at the bus stop? How do we allow for one and say, yeah, that's good religion, and disallow the other one and say that's poppycock, that's nonsense, that's drivel? By what mechanism do we allow for one and reject the other? You understand my question, Darshan? I don't really like letting you guys talk too much because everybody's so hoity-toity that they don't even show their face on the screen. But it's like I'm talking to a bunch of black boxes. And so it doesn't really lend itself very well to me having some kind of a more intimate, high-level exchange. I think I've problematized the situation enough. You guys can see the issue, right? Does somebody really think they've nailed it as far as an answer goes? Somebody ready to just crush it? They really feel like they got it? Oh, dude, really?
I think so, actually.
I'm a little worried, but okay.
Well, is it what you touched on before, of like the lying and the watching your actions? So it's like if this lunatic is saying, I am God, pretty much, or I am higher power, whatever it is, okay, well, what are they doing after that, or what are they doing before that? Whereas Krishna, same thing, it's the watching of the actions of what is he doing before and what's he doing after, all the time, essentially.
All right. What's your name again?
Margot.
Margot? I'm impressed. You just really impressed me. I think your answer is very good. I'm going to attack it in just a minute. Lori, give me a second. I'm in the middle of a conversation, but I see you. I'm going to attack it, but I like it, and I like it enough. I'm going to repeat it to everybody so everybody hears it, and I'm going to appreciate it, and then I'm going to attack it. So don't get discouraged. All right. Margot said, yeah, just like with a liar, you don't listen to what they say, you watch what they do. So let's watch what Krishna does. And if Krishna's God, we should see some evidence of Krishna's divinity. Margaret didn't say what that is, but that's fine. We can just, whatever that is, we can determine at a later point in the conversation. We should see some evidence of Krishna's divinity. And so that would then separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak, because you would have Psycho A at the bus stop who says this and then asks you for some bus money and picks a cigarette butt off the ground and smokes it and hawks up a lung cookie, and versus Krishna, who, and here's, so anyway, I like it because you are, I mean, it's good. It's like it gives you something. It does differentiate between the two. The problem is, what does Krishna do? Well, he shows his universal form. How do we know that? Because it says so in the book. You follow? I'm God. I showed it to some guy a long time ago. You can't see it now. You're just reading a book about it. But you should believe me because I wrote in my book that I showed the guy. I also write about elves and trolls and L. Ron Hubbard and Thetans and like galactic creatures that create a universe, and I got a Silver Surfer thrown in my comic book and all sorts of other stuff. And I said it, and I said there's a guy who saw it. I'll even draw you a picture of the guy who saw it. But does that mean that anything actually happened? And so because you're reading a book thousands of years later, what possible way do you have to watch Krishna's actions? You can't. All you have is his words to go by, and therefore you've defeated yourself. You follow that? Ouch. You see that? But the reason why I liked your answer is prima facie at first glance, it required a response from me. It may have ultimately proven untenable, but you didn't say something which was nonsensical or unrelated to the subject. You actually gave an answer which required us to take a further step towards truth. Therefore, it was a good answer. There wasn't anything problematic about it in that it didn't deserve to be addressed because you were like unpresent for the conversation and incapable of understanding what was being said. There may have been some lacking in terms of its long-term tenability, but at least you got out the starting gate. Does that make sense? So good job. Okay. Okay, I see you guys. Yeah. I see Shri and Kishori. Some of these other jokers are in dark rooms, which is kind of funky, but it's cool. I can. It's okay. Madhuri can do her thing. It's all right. I'm just happy you guys turned your cameras on. I was looking at blank spaces, so at least I'm looking at shadows in the dark now. It's a step up. We're moving forward. Lori, did you want to say something first? You piped in before Sri Devi did. No? Okay. Go, Sri Devi. You're up.
Oh, no, I don't have anything.
Okay, good. All right. Does anybody else want to take a shot?
Madhuri does.
She appears to be, I see some small, like something waving its hand in the
That's
dark.
why I was trying to raise my hand.
Okay. Go ahead, Madhuri.
I'm sorry, there's no lights on in my house.
I can tell. It's like we're in a slumber party in a tent or something like that. I feel like I'm 12. Actually, by the time I was 12, I wasn't doing that. But maybe I feel like I'm 6 again or something like that. Anyway, go ahead.
Well, I was just thinking that the Gita didn't occur in a vacuum. In the context of the Mahabharata, Krishna has a history. And if, for example, Shri told me, or you told me that you spoke this wisdom to someone at the dawn of time, it would be different for me than if some random person at a bus stop did it. It might not move the needle all the way for me, but I mean, if you said that to me, like, it would definitely make me pause. So I was just thinking that Krishna's history and the context affects.
All right. I initially thought that your response was very poor. And the reason I thought it was very poor was because I thought that my response to Margot was a full and complete response to you. Therefore, you were just wasting everybody's time by forcing me to repeat the exact same argument I repeated previously. However, I warmed up to your idea as you spoke it. And so I'm going to attack and then appreciate your idea. Essentially the opposite of what I did with Margot. Although I gave Margot a little bit of a sandwich. I appreciated, attacked, and then appreciated. But I just met her, so I had to do the sandwich approach. But with you, I'm going to just be like an open-faced sandwich. I'm going to attack you, and then I'm going to appreciate what you said. Because that's the order it occurred in my mind as you were speaking. Initially, yeah, the Mahabharata's a book. You can't verify any of it, therefore it's no evidence, and therefore my critique of Margot is the same as my critique of you. And great, instead of it being 700 verses, it's 70,000 verses. But what's the difference? It's the same thing. It's a book written by somebody, and therefore we're not really getting any evidence we can like see. We're just getting a book. It's a long book. So you're talking to a crazy guy for a long period of time. You can spin a whole yarn. Tell you, Tolkien wrote 3 books. You got like C.S. Lewis with his Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe series. You give somebody a long enough period of time, they'll write you a whole comic book series that might span 50 or 100 years, and all of a sudden, you got a huge backstory. That's my initial critique of what you said. The reason why I what your argument grew on me a little bit, is because you didn't say this, but I think what you said lends itself very well to what I'm going to say now. What kind of evidence would you expect from a book that it was divinely inspired? Whenever somebody says, show me the money, show me the evidence, I immediately ask them back, what would you accept as evidence? That this book was divinely inspired. What would you expect as evidence? What would you accept? If you ask me where's the evidence, and you're expecting me to show you a video, I can't do that. That's unfair. That's an unrealistic expectation. If a 5-year-old says, prove Einstein's theory of relativity to me, it's like, I can't. You're too young. You can't fathom it. Come back in 5-6 years I can explain it to you. Or maybe I can explain it to you like some broad strokes, but I can't really get into it with you, all the nitty-gritty. You don't speak the language of science yet enough to appreciate it. Prove to me this book in Japanese is about flowers. Well, go learn Japanese and come back and prove it to yourself. Or here's a Japanese person, but ultimately it's still an ipso dixit situation because he said it. It's still based on the authority of another because you don't have the skill set to judge for yourself. So we're dealing with a book. All we got is the book. How come you're smiling all funky, Shri? Just calm down. Relax.
I saw Keshiva pop up. Sorry.
Huh?
I saw Keshiva pop up.
All right.
Sorry.
Chillax, dude. So that's the downside of showing me your face is I can also see you doing other stuff during the class that you wouldn't get away with if we were face to face. We got a book. What would be evidence this book was divinely inspired? Oh, you couldn't show me any evidence. Well, then you now died the death of an unfalsifiable accusation. You follow? You're giving me a fight I can never win, so why am I even bothering with you? Is it unrealistic to think that there might be a divinely inspired book out there? If there's an all-good and all-powerful God, would he make knowledge of himself available in the world? Sure, why not? And so there's nothing wrong with the idea that a book may be divinely inspired, that God may reach out and touch humanity at various points. I don't see anything that's incorrect about that. Now we've got to figure out what would be the indication that was actually done. And if you get the footnotes of that, what would be the indication those footnotes were true? And so all I got is the book. All I got is words. Therefore, I have to figure out a way to separate the wheat from the chaff by looking at words. This, of course, could have been used by you to rebut what I said. You follow? You could have said what I just said now and defeated the critique I made of you 10 minutes ago. Now do you follow what I'm saying? And you didn't make this argument, Madhuri, but I was going to make this argument anyway, and what you said was, it works well with this, so I figured we'd throw it out there. Does that make sense? So, what does that look like? Well, you got a whole tradition of people, you have a whole theology, you have a concrete, comprehensive theology. It makes sense, it's logical, it's reasonable, it's coherent, there's no eternal hell, which is totally incompatible with an all-good God. There's no your immortal sin because of the sins of your father, which doesn't make sense with an all-good God, putting people in jail for the crimes of their parents. So the Krishna and the Gita doesn't appear to have any massive deficiencies, which would mean it couldn't possibly be God. And there's a whole theology which has been laid out. And so I don't see any reason that this couldn't be divinely inspired. Ultimately, to figure out whether it was or not, I'd have to start to use the text in my own life, and I'd have to have some divine experiences by following the protocols or technologies that are outlined in the book. I'd have to have some experience of Krishna as a result of that. And then that would be the proof that the experiment listed in the lab manual. Like, what's the proof the lab manual works? Well, without going in the laboratory, there is none. You go in the laboratory, there is some. You can see some people's signatures on the book, some big PhD names on the book. You can have a bunch of people tell you it works. But ultimately, to know the lab manual works, if you want that kind of concrete evidence, you got to get in the laboratory. If the lab manual is making a spiritual claim, you got to get in the spiritual laboratory. If my argument is that something beyond matter exists, then there's no reason why my experiments aren't allowed to take you beyond matter. We can start with things like consciousness that are empirically observable, that consciousness is a non-material force that goes beyond the laws of physics. Chemicals, physics is dependent on chemicals. Physics is the laws by which chemicals interact. Physics is a secondary set of laws which governs the precursor chemical world. You follow? Physics is the rules of the chemical world, which is a pre-existing reality. You follow? We don't find consciousness in chemicals. So we have access to something empirically observable which goes beyond chemistry, therefore beyond physics. So to really make that argument, I'd take a lot more time, but I've already gotten like 12-minute nudge, and so I'm just going to leave it at that for today. That's a little bit of a different angle than I normally take, a little bit less long-winded, a little more tight. There are certainly some evidence of spiritual reality that we find in this world, namely our consciousness. And so there's good reason to think that there might be something beyond this world, beyond matter in this world. Then there has to be a source of that stuff, and so that would be a God. A source of consciousness would be a God. The God. Maybe if you get back to one ring to rule them all, you get back to the God. So the idea of theism is perfectly reasonable, and now we're just left wondering. In other words, if I want to argue theism with you, I'm not even going to look at my Gita. I'm going to argue theism naturally. Once I establish that theism is reasonable, now the next question is, could this book be divinely inspired? If you admit to me that you're a closet atheist, I'm not going to bother even trying to tell you my book is divinely inspired. I'm going to argue theism versus atheism with you just based on this world around us. Once I win that argument, now I'll argue that this book is representative of what good theism looks like. Did you follow that? And then furthermore, I'll challenge you to go and use the book. If I can get a good hypothesis down that seems reasonable enough, and your evidence, Madhuri, lends itself to the good hypothesis argument, then that should get people in the laboratory doing an experiment. Did you guys follow that? For whatever it's worth, I didn't engineer this argument. I just read the text, the questions occurred to me, I made it as difficult as I could to answer, and I answered it. I didn't script it, which is why you saw me jump back to a natural theology argument at the end there, where it wasn't how I started. I realized halfway through, I wouldn't even bother arguing with you that the Gita was legitimate. So now the structure looks all neat and clean. How do I know that the Gita is not that truck stop junkie talking to me? Right? How do you differentiate yourself from that truck stop junkie? Right? Number one, you believe in God? No. Then I don't want to try and talk about my sacred text. You're conscious, dude. Consciousness isn't material. Chemicals aren't conscious. Chemicals don't have free will. Chemicals don't have thoughts about other chemicals. Well, if you get a bunch of chemicals together. No, there's no evidence of that. Doesn't make any sense. Put chemicals together. I don't see it makes a person. There's some kind of je ne sais quoi about consciousness, something that can't quite be stated. That's because your model doesn't work, because you have a chemical model of the world, and your chemical model can't account for something as basic as consciousness. Therefore, your model has to be revised. We live in a biocentric universe where life and consciousness is. Are you smiling again, Tree? Where consciousness is properly basic. Once I win that debate with you, now we've accepted that God exists and that the soul exists. Now we can talk about whether my text is reminiscent of that. Hey, it is for like 1 billion people around the world, or 700 million to be more appropriate. 700 million people find this text to be valid. It's been valid for thousands of years. It presents a coherent, reasonable theology. Krishna fulfills all the criteria of an all-good, all-powerful God. There's no eternal hell. There's no immortal sin. There's no untenable philosophical ideas presented. It's a clean theology. Well, that's still not the same as proving. You're right. I've showed you a coherent model. I've done what Richard Dawkins did. I've showed you a workable theory. Now get in the laboratory, because you can never know that the lab manual works until you get in the laboratory. And so get in the laboratory and do the experiment. I give you a good enough hypothesis, that should get you out the gate. I've shown you spirit exists, God exists. We've argued that one. I've shown you this is a reasonable book about it. It's inspired a lot of people. Let's take a look at some of the wisdom and let's try and practice this in your life, and let's see what happens. You find yourself embracing Krishna down the road, dancing with Krishna down the road, you'll be able to come back to me and tell me that you did the experiment and you proved it was true. But some things in life are ostensive. They have to be seen. You can't describe to a person blind from birth what red looks like. They've never seen color. How do you teach people color? You show a child, you say that's red, that's green, that's blue. That's how children learn colors. They look at it. Seeing Krishna's like that. You have to see it to understand it, and then you're like, wow, that text was a portal. That text was a bridge. That text had an invaluable insight to help me on my individual journey back to Godhead. We can critique it intellectually. I'll defend that. I can defend it's a coherent system. I can defend that God exists. I can defend that it's reasonable to believe that God exists, that soul exists. I can defend all that. But ultimately, you want to know if Krishna's God? Get in the lab. Do some work. Put some skin in the game. You know if she's the girl of your dreams? Take her out on a date. Can't figure it all out, sitting around with your PS4 with your buddies playing video games. You're going to have to get out of your house, get off the couch, and go out and do something. We forget about the responsibility that goes to the person who wants the proof. I want proof that that book's in Japanese. I got to go learn Japanese. I have a responsibility. I have an epistemic responsibility. I have a responsibility to become capable of perceiving the evidence. Do you follow that argument? That's how I would respond. So we can look at L. Ron Hubbard, and we can look at his theology, and we can see it's sorely lacking. Heck, I don't want to be too harsh. We can look at the Bible, and we can see its theology is sorely lacking. We can look at the human sacrifice of Mayan culture, and all respects to indigenous cultures, we can see it's sorely lacking. And I'm not in some ivory tower. I'll get out on the mat with you. You can look at my tradition too. If we're going to debate, it's got to be on the basis of an intellectual approach. a systematic intellectual approach, critical thinking skills, logical discussion. I'm going to start by convincing you that spirit exists. Then I'm going to show you that this book is like representative of a good spiritual culture. Maybe not the best, but certainly a legitimate one. That's what that argument would look like. Oh, that was some work for me. Dharmendra Nijadam, you want to comment?
I was just thinking, Prabhuji, so you answered the question by saying that I will go and work on finding some, working on in the laboratory or in the real life to get faith in what somebody is saying, what Krishna is saying. To believe what Krishna is saying is true. We will go out in the laboratory and work on our Krishna consciousness to develop that faith in what he's saying.
Yeah, you repeated yourself 3 times. You're repeating what I said, and you said it 3 times. I understood what you were repeating the first time. Please continue.
So is that the right understanding? I'm saying...
No. You just took what I said, and you took a tiny piece out of what I said. I just made a fairly complicated argument. It was fairly complex. It's like if I was to teach trigonometry, and you go, so it's 2 + 2 = 4. Maybe that's part of it. Maybe trigonometry is based on on arithmetic, but you just took a tiny piece of what I said. And without the rest of what I said, that doesn't work, because it's like, okay, so blindly follow what I say. Hey, Nijadam, give me all your money and slit your throat and you'll see God. That's my hypothesis, and to prove it, you have to give me all your money and slit your throat and kill yourself. That's ridiculous. I went through a much more comprehensive, step-by-step process from outlining the existence of the soul and God without reference to a text, to then discussing what good theology would look like, to then showing what a good hypothesis might look like, and to then challenging someone. If you separate those parts from one another, which is what you just did, you butcher the whole thing, and you're left asking for blind faith. You're not going to summarize. I mean, I guess I just summarized what I said, so I guess you could summarize it, but you got to do a good job. Otherwise, in your summarizing of what I said, you missed 2 of the 3 points. That's a 33%. It's a colossal fail. Do not refer to your sacred text. Argue based on natural theology that God exists. Number 2, demonstrate that the Gita represents a coherent theology. Number 3, show that it's a good hypothesis, good enough to warrant you jumping in and putting some skin in the game. 3 pieces. I guess I was going to say don't try to summarize me, but I guess don't try to summarize me unless you can do a good job. Sorry, but...
Thank you, Prabhuji, for...
By the way, just so everybody knows, Nijadam has a double PhD. He has 2 PhDs. What are your PhDs in?
No, just 1 PhD, Prabhuji, master's and a PhD. It's in high-speed interconnects, high-speed electronics.
Your master's degree, and then you also have a PhD, 2 different subjects?
On the same subject, yeah.
Yeah, so you went and got a master's, and you went back and got a PhD. Weren't you like a gold medalist at your university?
Yes, university medal, Prabhuji. Yeah, it was technical subject. So.
It's like being the valedictorian. And how many languages do you speak?
I speak English and Hindi and Vraj. I don't know if Vraj is considered a language.
Of course it is. Yeah. Just 3? Okay. Anyway, he's a smart guy. So forgive me. But, when we get in this discussion together, we're all one. We level the playing field. And me with my high school diploma get to debate with PhDs. This is what it is. If you're with us on IGTV, thank you very much for joining us. Hope you found some merit in the discussion. If you're on Zoom and Facebook, stick around for a minute and we'll entertain another question or 2. Who else has something they want to contribute?